Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Monica Dragos and I co-created this program. Today, we will be in conversation with Jeanine Canty about her new book, Returning the Self to Nature, Undoing Our Collective Narcissism, and Healing Our Planet. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, I currently live in the traditional territory of the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, under the treaties of peace and friendship. I offer gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who live here now and who have lived here for thousands of years, for the legacy of caring for the land, water, fire, and air. I do acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization and systemic oppression of the people and the land on which we reside. Today, I invite us to uncolonize our work and widen our systems of care and responsibility. Now, a little bit more about today's guest. Jeanine M. Canty, PhD, lives in the foothills above Boulder, Colorado, within the ancestral lands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne and Utah peoples. I hope I said those right. She is a professor within the Transformative Studies doctoral program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And she also guest teaches for Naropa University, Pacifica Graduate Institute, and Prescott College. A lover of nature, justice, and contemplative practice, her teaching intersects issues of social and ecological justice connected to the process of worldview expansion and positive change. Jeanine, I am so honored and grateful that you're sharing your time and wisdom with us today. Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we get started?
No, that says plenty, and I'm so honored to be with you all and for the invitation. You know, it's always so nice to be with folks that circulate this topic and ecopsychology in general. So, yay.
Super. So I've read your book twice.
Oh, well.
It gives me a lot to think about and to chew on. And I just want to read your dedication. This book is dedicated to Earth and all her beloveds, each and every sentient being. May we remember that we are family, unraveling our dysfunction and renewing our bonds. And it just makes me wonder, Jeanine, what catalyzed you to write this book about returning to nature and undoing our collective narcissism?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I tend to be less of a, I think, over intellectualized, heady academic, and try to be pretty embodied and just pay attention to what's going on in often my personal life will be the kind of trigger for some sort of inquiry. And in this case, I was dating a man who might be considered a narcissist or someone with narcissistic personality disorder or NPD, but I'm not a licensed therapist. And even if I was, it's really hard to diagnose. And it's not about this person, but it got me studying narcissistic personality disorder a bit, both from kind of more academic stances to pop psychology to people who have been in relationships with narcissists and have kind of dramatic blogs, which you can read all day long. And what really came up for me, because it was a painful experience, but just having a level of compassion for someone who might be labeled a narcissist, because they're often the kind of prescription is to just get away from this person because they're so toxic. And in my orientation, I've learned from wisdom holders that anytime there's a personal disorder, it's really about the larger community. So I wondered, what does narcissism have to teach us? And narcissism such a buzzword with, political leaders, not to name anyone in particular, and famous people, and your neighbor, your loved one. And so we're kind of swimming in narcissistic memes. And I also thought about in the environmental movement, we have that term, especially environmental justice, not in my backyard, where if we have toxic waste, some sort of polluting industry in our community, often we'll push it to someone else's community, not thinking that if we get it out of here, especially like Boulder, Colorado, that'll go to another neighborhood. And I saw that pattern with narcissists. If you get away from your toxic person, they're just going to latch on to someone else. And I wish someone had given me a heads up before I had entered this relationship.
So can you give us a simple summary of defining what is narcissism? Not all of us are psychologists here.
Yeah, and I think in years to come we'll have such more information about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. And so really it's when someone has a huge what we would call ego or a sense of self, where they're so oriented to their own needs and image and the way they present to the external world, that they really have a hard time thinking about anyone but themselves. And there's a narcissistic scale that Dr. Craig Malkin created. It's very simple. It's 1 to 10. And the idea that actually all of us are narcissists, and actually we should be to a certain degree, but we want to be healthy narcissists. So we have a healthy sense of self. So we'd want to be somewhere on the level 5. And we don't want to be extreme narcissists or narcissistic personality disorder, which would be a level 10 or, right up there. And we don't want to be having a very low self-esteem, like a 1 or 2 or 3, which ironically, someone with narcissistic personality actually has both of those ranges, because underneath that, they actually have a really deep sense of insecurity. And so there's just some common patterns for someone who is an extreme narcissist. And it's having this overblown sense of ego, really arrogance, always needing to be at the center of attention, having basically shamelessness, no shame. If you tell them that they've hurt you or done something wrong, it's always about you and not about them. They just can't take that input. And in fact, they have a hypersensitivity to critique. So if you critique a narcissist, often they will get enraged and cannot take that input and will not believe it. And if it's given strongly enough, they'll cut you out of their life. And then there's just a sense of entitlement and a need to feel special, but we're all special, but more special than others. So almost like it's their birthday every day. And one other piece with that that's important is that often we think that a narcissist is kind of just like this jerk, but we don't think about their larger story of like, how did they get to be this way? Oh, and even with me using the word jerk, you might say, well, why would anyone even get into a relationship with a narcissist? But they tend to be pretty magnetizing because, they're very boastful and exude a certain sense of confidence. And so they can present, and they're very concerned with how others perceive them. And a narcissist, their kind of core wound is around early childhood. And there's a few people say that there could be a genetic factor to narcissistic personality disorder, but it's actually one of 4 cluster B disorders. And it's the only one that's not actually scientifically proven as having any genetic resonance. And so the core wound in early childhood, all of those, probably a lot of folks here are familiar with attachment theory, or back in the day, we'd call it object relations theory, and how there's two damaging patterns in early childhood. And one is when the primary caregiver gives the child too much attention, excessive need demands, but not healthy attention, but attention for the child to actually satisfy the primary caregiver need. So it's, it's all about mommy, it's all about daddy, it's all about, whoever the primary caregiver. And the second faulty pattern is basically attention withdrawn too early. So just not giving the young child sufficient attention and mirroring. And in either case, the child ends up with damaged trust in the world. And so the narcissistic personality disorder rooting from childhood, that individual creates this kind of false reality, a cocoon, where they're at the center and they have to construct, kind of a fictitious circumstance because they're just so wounded. And it's really hard for them to peer out of that into any sort of reality where there's actually feedback.
So that gives me a good sense, but I'm curious, what are the characteristics now of collective narcissism?
Yeah. And this is really a lot of the crux of the book. When I had this experience and I did so much research about narcissistic personality disorder and extreme narcissism, I remembered that some of the earliest ecopsychologists wrote about the connection between consumerism and narcissism, and how that's obviously so destructive to the earth. And so I started thinking about these common patterns of a narcissist and how they relate to our collective society as more of an archetype right now. We see so many people, basically are very Western, and I'm very US centric. I was born and raised in the US, so I think it's kind of obvious too that the US embodies this most strongly. We're number one at narcissism, at collective narcissism. But how society really encourages us to almost be our own reality TV stars every day, where we can be posting all day long on social media, that with the Western meme of kind of, particularly US, of fierce individualism, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, those with the most toys wins. We create this kind of false reality that's based on outward desires, from the overculture of we should look the best, we should have the highest income, the most successful employment, the best looking partner, the nicest house, the most toys. And so we can easily get so caught up in this outward projection and fake image. And so we go back to those traits of the narcissist, where we need to feel so special, so fiercely individual, but in a competitive way. I need to be better than my neighbors, better than my coworkers, better than my partner and coworkers. And I can't handle critique and feedback. It's really easy to be discompassionate towards others, because if I'm constantly fueling the machine of myself, how can I even think about what the other people around me need and what's going on in their worlds, because they're actually really interested in my world. And then, of course, I wouldn't even give a thought to what's going on with Mother Earth. And so really looking at that collective meme and going back to object relations theory, where we had damaged trust with our primary caregiver. From an ecopsychology perspective, we often think, of course, our primary caregiver is Mother Earth. None of us would be alive without all of the, the water and the air and being able to live within the body of Earth and sun and all of everything. Were just impossible. And so we come from the womb of our mothers and the womb of Mother Earth, but from our kind of Western disassociation with nature. And unfortunately, anyone who extend Western to anyone who's living under a corporate globalized paradigm, which unfortunately are most people these days. So we've kind of lost our trust with Mother Earth, our primary caregiver, because we weren't raised under those traditions, most of us, and we've supplanted that primary caregiver with kind of a paternal, corporate, globalized father. I would say father. It could be any gender of parent. And so we have most folks within this kind of societal mean pledges allegiance to corporate globalized paradigm.
Mm. So you introduced the concept of ecological narcissism. How does that relate to collective narcissism?
Yeah, it's the same. It's really the same in terms of we've become such a selfish population, and not because we're bad people, but because we live in a society that's projecting these false needs and wants. And so again, we're not attending to climate change, climate crisis, all of and when I talk about climate crisis, I'm also talking about not only ecological, but all the social justice, because they're totally enmeshed. They're all the same issues.
Mm. So, I'm noticing the emergence of eco-influencers, kind of like self-help gurus popped up. And my question is, how can we prevent eco-psychology, ecotherapy, nature connection activities and programs from becoming, in your words, co-opted by our narcissistic traits?
Yeah, this is such a big deal. I mean, I even sometimes have to like check myself as I have lovely invitations like today, to, oh, you're going to all listen to me talk about my work or trying to promote work. And there's so many different organizations or individuals or movements where often kind of the skills that we've been given if we've been raised under Western culture is like a self-promotion, and it can easily turn into a greenwashing of these tools and techniques and realities. So it can't be an intellectual pursuit. It definitely needs to have embodied practice, and I think a certain humbling. So much of it is actually always remembering to serve the greater whole of all sentient beings. So I think just remembering to keep disrupting some of the larger narrative and not, not drinking that Kool-Aid. Yeah.
So, how can we nudge people to move beyond self-healing? I always hear, oh, I got to heal myself first, and then I'll worry about other people, then I'll worry about the earth. So how do we in your words, shed our addiction to individualism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different ways, and there's no, in the book I talk about, just even with healing, there's no set format for each individual, and I think that's something that we need to always remember, that so much of the mess that we're in today is because of our Western focus on standardization and homogeny, and we don't want that. We want to have diversity of practices based on not only our bioregions, but just even our own myriad of diverse social locations and so many different things. So really recognizing that, but there are, of course, some common patterns and traits. In the book, list some, and then, more keep emerging as well. But I think really going back to the first thing is like the awareness and unraveling. I think it's so easy to, I taught at Naropa University for so long, and then I currently am full-time at CIS, and both of those institutions are very East meets West and spiritual, and it can be easy, and I'm involved with Dharma communities, it can be easy to fall into more of a spiritual bypassing, and what you're talking about, like over Boulder is like the capital of self-care from my perspective. So always staying with the awareness of actually what's going on all around the planet. We don't need to know every issue, every circumstance of injustice, but just really keeping a beat on what's happening planetary and various communities and the collective, so we can be awake and aware. I have friends who I gander from what they share, not really close friends, but that have been taking news breaks for years now, maybe since the pandemic started. And you're like, well, that's really interesting, and you bring something up, and they don't really want to hear about it because it's gonna pop their peaceful bubble. But so we need to be able to unravel the issues. I'm always inspired by the work of one of my dear mentors and friends, Joanna Macy and others. So being awake and aware, but also similar to Joanna Macy and Emma Chodron and Miriam Greenspan and so many others, of being able to work with difficult emotions, recognizing that with like painful information, all of these kind of repressed, both consciously and unconscious emotions will surface. And so we can easily go into all sorts of defense mechanisms around it, or we can have better tools to attend to our emotions. And it's interesting, I get amazed. I am childless by choice, but I have so many friends who are raising kids, and they're getting like different skill sets than when I was a kid. It was like, oh, you like tap in all the time and talk about your emotions and have all this. And so I think there's something really important with both young people, but more so I'm focused on adult transformative experiences, how we can actually retool to attend to our emotions, feel them, and stay open to that, and also learn how to work with them in a mindful way, so it doesn't actually have to be a constant story about self and like who's hurting me, what's hurting me, blah, 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 but how does this actually peer out into the collective. I love when I got tuned into ecopsychology in the late 90s. It was like such a kind of pull up the shades and be like, yeah, that's it. Because I was also so involved in looking at social justice issues, that the classic way of doing psychology, which is so person-centered and a lot of navel gazing. And I think everyone should go through personal counseling for a little bit, but it doesn't have to be a forever pursuit, or if it is a forever pursuit, it also needs to be brought into what's happening in the world. And so, maybe my depression isn't about me, but isn't it incredibly healthy to have sadness and overwhelm and anxiety when we're feeling the collective vibe of what's happening upon Earth? And so starting to open it up and see, oh, all of these, neuroses that I'm experiencing, while they can be part of my like little story, they're actually rooted in a much bigger story, and we're collectively having this. So people can kind of be invited to step outside of themselves. And so mindfulness, I think, is such a important tool of being able to have critical tools for self-reflection, not only to see kind of our thinking loops of thought that are happening all the time and just start disrupting that, but also being mindful of, are we just always focused on activities to even improve and better self? And can we be mindful of what Joanna Macy and others would say, widening circles of connections. And I think in ecopsychology and deep ecology, as probably most of us on this call know, there's that term, the ecological self, which I never get tired of. And it's a way that, Arnie Ness, the kind of founder of deep ecology and ecosophy, really brought that term to life in terms of, he would use the term often, self-realizing, where we can move from our small ego to the ecological self, in terms of maybe we have a start being connected to a bird that's always outside, or a particular tree, or even a house plant, or a lake that we love, a creek, whatever, a non-human entity that we actually start to have a little bit of kind of a love affair with. And we slowly begin to realize, or maybe even quickly, that our wellness is bound up with theirs, and we feel connected. And then the boundaries of our kind of very small, ego, wherever that may land, starts to break. And ego in traditional psychology isn't a bad thing. It's really just a rational organizing principle. We've kind of repackaged it into something that's so about our identity. So when we can actually, one of my favorite things to do this year is actually apologizing to my ego and being like, I'm so sorry, I've been overworking you all my life. You take a break, because I only need you for certain types of functions. So don't feel like you need to be on the ride everywhere. And in my meditation this year, I had a little aha moment where I don't know if anyone else thinks about this, but I was like, so if I'm not supposed to be in my ego self all the time, where does my ego go that would feel good? And the practice was like, well, the ego just rests in the heart. And it was like, oh, my heart is actually big enough to hold my ego, and then I can be available for a much wider experience. And with the ecological self, not only did we start having maybe we were connected to the bird or the bear or the creek, but we start becoming interested in our ecosystem and our bioregion, and we start actually really feeling that web. And so our larger self starts to rest in that web. And that's similar. One of my dearest mentors, Carl Anthony, he, in that classic ecopsychology book that Theodore Roszak, Mary Gomes, and Alan Cantor put together, he's got an interview with Theodore Roszak, and he introduces this term called the multicultural self. And I've really developed that a bit more, inspired by Carl Anthony. And he really talks about growing up in Philadelphia and how he never learned the stories of who was his neighbors, in that community. He was learning about the Pilgrims and the forefounders and all of these folks that had nothing to do with his day-to-day experience. And that happens with so many of us, that we actually don't know the stories of diverse people in our community. And the multicultural self, when we actually start to like the ecological self, be able to step out of our own shoes and maybe understand one individual that's has a different maybe social location or just even a political worldview or whatever. And we actually start expanding our small self to be able to hold more than one worldview. And then we do that with multiple different people. We actually start being able to step into multiple shoes in a way that who we thought we were no longer is. And that's similar for those of us that are more into depth psychology, that the reality of life and sentience. Is there's also a whole transpersonal world that also includes both seen and unseen beings. And so when we can start not having to lead the show all the time with our rational, linear, ego, thought-driven, individual nature. And I always like to call it grace, but actually having a deep surrender, we might listen and notice that, so many of the wisdom holders and poets who are wisdom holders as well always talk about, like, listen to that very small, quiet voice. And sometimes that voice starts getting louder, and sometimes maybe it's more than one voice. And it's not like something you might hear, some people hear, but it's just kind of like knowing guidance and allyship comes in a different form. And I think that's so key for the ecological crisis, because often as Westerners, we take on like the heroic stance, like, don't, I need to like lick the ecological crisis within my lifetime through just my efforts or just through this one group. And we're gonna, eradicate all the harmers in the world. And it's such a kind of ego-driven pursuit, even though we want to help. And if we actually realize that we have deeper wisdom and guidance that's so much more intelligent than human capacity, and if we actually just drop into that and bring our kind of conscious, rational intellect into balance with more of that transpersonal, as well as even just, it's so important to get into our somatic embodied sense, back to our instinctual selves, our sensual, perceptual selves, our spiritual self. We suddenly have so much guidance. So those are a handful, and there's other things as well.
Super. My goodness, I could listen to you all day, but I think we'll end the interview here, and then we'll open it up to the group to see. So Monica, you want to take it away? I'm just going to end the spotlight here.
Sure. So we're wanting to return to the format today, or offer the suggestion that if some people feel like they can articulate their question in the chat, we can keep the recording going longer and have that offered up to everybody. And if there's people who really want to be able to verbalize their question, we can save that for the end and turn off the recording at that point and just have a little bit more of a live discussion that way. So just going to invite people now to start popping their questions into the chat, or comments as well. And in the meantime, Jeanine, I don't know if this is a fair question. I'm just wondering in a very general way, with your teaching and your time with students, with the subject matter that you're specializing in, if you have examples or have observed ways that people reconnecting to nature sort of combats narcissism or heals narcissism. And I'm just kind of curious about that. And just even thinking about that responsibility piece, it strikes me, of course, like, that one of the core things of narcissism, it's like, I'm special, I'm powerful, but I'm never to blame, right? Like I never, there's not that responsibility. And you see that with people with the climate crisis, it's like, it's the earth cycles. It's not that anything we've done, so everything revolves around us until something is wrong, So anyway, that's mixing a few things together, but just curious about your thoughts about some of that, or how nature kind of disabuses us of this notion that, like we are special or above nature,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think I said earlier, I came to ecopsychology. First, I was actually studying a lot of multicultural education and looking at a lot of social justice issues. And at the same time, or right after that, I kind of stumbled upon ecopsychology. And I was actually teaching my, I was in my, I was in my late 20s, and I was teaching the first college class I ever taught. It was a multicultural education course, and it was to a group of all white, kind of younger people, and there was some at the time. Now it's such a different experience teaching those subjects, but there was a group of resistors in the class, and I was still quite a young person relatively, and so my triggers got flared, and a colleague turned me on to the work of I'm just going to forget his name, but it's pretty much the developmental approach to intercultural sensitivity. And that always stuck with me, that people go from when they're looking at social justice issues, particularly around like racism, they go from kind of more of a linear stages of first denial, then defense, then minimization, and at some point acceptance, and then integration, and then or adaptation, and then integration. So kind of a developmental spectrum. And I working with that turned it more into a circle, because we can suddenly be so evolved around one issue, and then another issue pops in and we're back to maybe defense or denial. And at the same time, I was working a lot with Joanna Macy, and in partnership with Molly Young Brown, they have these two lists in that in the early edition of Coming Back to Life, where they talk about reasons people don't acknowledge and work with the ecological crisis, and also consequences of that, of repressing it. And it was so interesting. I paired those two models together, and then I was doing my doctorate shortly after in transformative learning. And there's a whole spectrum of theory around how adults change their worldview. And a worldview basically has two different components. Well, it has lots of them, but two main is a habit of mind and then a resulting point of view. And the habit of mind is all of the things that we're kind of handed that construct our worldview, like our gender and our political affiliation, where we live, our religion, our economic class, like all of these things that we didn't necessarily come to ourselves. And then the resulting point of view is how we act those out in our life. And so it was really interesting to use these models together, and designing how to work with adults of any age, from 18 to 100 or upwards. And So a lot of it, because with the climate crisis, you can go through the same stages of denial, defense, onwards. And so bringing it into transformative learning, so much of it is actually being able to reflect on our stories. So I work a lot with the transforming learning concept of disorienting dilemmas that Jack Mesereau coined. And this is when you have some sort of usually unjarring event that basically rocks your worldview. And so, you're usually like, it makes you have the phase of like, and you don't know what to do with it. You can either pretend that everything's all the same and let's just rationalize those weird events back into the cocoon small worldview, which is very similar to the small worldview of a narcissist, or we can meet the challenge of unpacking that story and why it rubs or triggers our assumptions that we hold in our current worldview. And so the key to that is to attend to the story, unpack it, but have critical self-reflection. And I think so much of the work in ecopsychology paired with nature practices gives us some of the tools for maybe being able to self-reflect more, but I think it needs to be doubled down so much more strongly, because you can easily give practices and someone can just feel like they're similar to what Carol was asking me about, kind of just like they're, nature girl, and they bring their eco bag everywhere and do all the right things, but they're not really thinking about the larger plight of the planet. So really being able to break out of our constructed realities and to be mindful of what's really here. And so I think definitely all of these various kind of mindfulness, contemplative practices, but there needs to be a leap in terms of also being exposed to often unjarring information, whether it's through a book or a documentary, or witnessing a clear-cut forest, or just immense waste in somewhere. But all of those moments where we know we're triggered and uncomfortable, and to ask, like, why is that? And I find it can be incredibly powerful. I don't know if I'm addressing your question at all, but yeah.
I really appreciated you talking about these developmental models, and that's just, I've been exposed to some of them, but I think it's such a great reminder, and there's just, you said a lot of interesting things in there, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, good. And that development model, the first one, it's by Milton Bennett.
Milton Bennett. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to read some more questions from the chat. And I think that they probably, at least the first one from Linda, probably ties into what we were just talking about too. She's asking, how might cultural humility fit into this idea?
Okay. And let me see.
Maybe collective narcissism in general, I'm thinking.
Yeah. And cultural humility, will you say more about that, Linda?
It's a concept that I've been reading about. I can't remember the exact name of the person who came up with it. But the whole idea of how we privilege one culture, our own, often narcissistically, over other cultures. So it probably fits in with what you're saying about the multicultural self. How can we get beyond that to the point where we really see and acknowledge and begin to be humble and understand other cultures in a way that most of us don't?
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. In fact, in the book, I write a section on the relationship between narcissism and whiteness, which is always a hair raiser, or not always. I think people are so open to those dialogues these days, but really, and also weaving in some of the work around white fragility. But really, again, we've been culturally acculturated within Western culture. And again, I'm very US centric to think that whiteness is the standard that we should actually abide by. And in the US particularly, but in some other places too, whiteness was actually given out as a privilege to anyone who could pass as white to get with the program of basically colonization and eventually corporate globalization. And so whiteness is so associated with individualism, with a sense of entitlement, with being really special. And so it's not saying that white people are more narcissists than anyone else, but systems of white supremacy are inherently narcissistic. And so I think when we can unpack that a little bit, we realize that, and I think it's happening so much so if we're, again, paying attention, that we have so many folks that are really dropping into more separate kind of identity subcultures because they don't want to be like white standardized. And you know, people of color also can easily be striving to the white standards too, with so many different forms, and even more so if someone feels less than. And so I think the more that we actually get presented with other models of being, whether it's subcultures or other different cultures, without obviously cultural appropriation, which is always a no-no, we actually can start realizing, like, what are my inherent true likes and desires and ways of being that aren't parallel with what's been put upon me.
Great. Yes, thank you. That helps.
Okay.
So maybe for Carol and Jeanine, I'm going to have you both maybe weigh in on this. We have still 3 really well thought out questions in the chat, and I know we wanted to do a bit of live time too. So I don't know. I know that Carol said that we try to stick to the time that we have here, but I don't know if it's an option to go a bit past time, and while giving people who need to leave kind of our blessing to do that. Thoughts? Can we get to all these questions in the chat and then still have a bit of live time after? Or
Let's see. I could go a few minutes over, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important for both. So why don't we just drop into it and see where we end up?
okay,
and maybe, I'll try to be more pithy too.
Okay, maybe we'll do that. So Peggy was asking if the narcissist can fake that they care about people or environmental issues.
Hi, Peggy. Good to see you again. And yeah, definitely. In fact, I think that is when someone with NPD works with a therapist, that's actually one of the tools that they're given it's almost like fake it until you make it. And I don't know if a narcissist truly starts to feel compassion, but at least they're starting to ask. And so that's definitely something in their wheelhouse if they're getting good support.
Okay, and Real was asking about, he made a comment that in the local paper where he's living, that the university stated some statistics about decline of applications to university environmental studies and science programs. If younger people are becoming increasingly self-focused, how might this be shifted?
Yeah, I was not aware of the declining applications. That's disappointing because there's more and more jobs in those areas. They should be applying. But yeah, I think definitely as we talk more about these issues from within our households, but also in both public and private, non-secondary institutions, I think giving more support to that. Yeah, I'll have to look at that because I almost had a different sense because there's so much, from the Greta Thunbergs of the world and all of the documentaries and all of the eco catastrophes happening in so many communities. I would think more and more young people seem kind of hip to it. Yeah.
Our last question in the chat is, how do you see initiatory rights supporting a deep sense of self as an ecological self? And
yeah, I mean, that's such a important question, and we could probably spend some hours on that one as well. I think it's so important because, as probably most of you know, in ecopsychology, there's the term arrested development, and really saying that most people in our society, we never had the healthy rites of passage to actually become mature adults. So most leaders and everyday adults in our society are really like, at best, preteens or teenagers. And so we can appear very selfish and narcissistic. And it's really those rites of passage that change that. And so I think there's both the nature rites of passage, whether it's, I have friends that just dropped off their kids for, summer camp, and, what a great immersion in nature and community. And there's all sorts of, ecotherapy programs and wilderness rites of passage for youth, hopefully not because they're in trouble, but often when they're in trouble. But there's also, I really appreciate the work of the late Malidoma Somé, who said, we don't actually need to pull on the traditions of earth-based and indigenous peoples for rites of passage. Westerners actually need to navigate all the rites of passage that are presented to them within their everyday life traumas, whether it's like divorce or coming out or breaking up with a partner or religion or physical illness. There's so many rites of passage that are going on that we're not attending to in that sacred way. And then I think in ecopsychology and ecotherapy and kind of related fields, we have to be, and I'm sure you've had guests and are doing this in your own work, of just not appropriating other, particularly Indigenous, First Nations people's rites of passage, but to actually, and we can go back to whatever roots we may come from. There's so many folks going back to European traditions if you align with your, but I think it's more important to actually developing our ecological and transpersonal selves to allow the land and kind of the collective psyche to guide us to what rites of passage are wanting to come out. And so we don't have to like flip to the book or some other teacher, but so much of this is what Krishnamurti would call becoming a firsthand being again, where we have a direct relation to the sacred and we can actually start firing that up again.
Thank you. I'm going to end the recording right